Webinar. I'm Alistair Mackay, the Director of Reconciliation Initiatives. I really appreciate you showing up for today's webinar. This is jointly sponsored by Reconciliation Initiatives and HeartEdge and is part of a small series of webinars that we're offering across the course of 2021. You may have had, I don't know what you've had going on for you today, but you may well have had quite a lot going on. So let's just take a moment to center ourselves. So find a comfortable upright position for yourself, maybe with your hands open facing upwards, and we'll have just a minute of quiet, and then I will offer a prayer for us before we get going. So maybe take one or two deeper breaths for yourself, and we'll just have a minute of remembering God's presence with us. Gracious and glorious God, we bless you for your love shown to us in so many ways. Give us ears to listen to you as we listen to one another this afternoon. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, I'm joined by 4 bishops and by Sam Wells. So I'd like to invite each of you to introduce yourselves. Let's go around sort of alphabetically by first names. So Andrew, would you kick off?
Yes, good afternoon. Hello everyone. I am Andrew Swift and I'm the Bishop of Brechin in the Scottish Episcopal Church, which actually means I'm the Bishop of Dundee, but we call dioceses by old-fashioned historical names. But Bishop of based in Dundee in the Scottish Episcopal Church. Fantastic,
thanks Andrew. And Guli.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Guli Francis Dehani, and I have been the Bishop of Chelmsford for all of 1 week, but I'm still living in Loughborough, where I've been Bishop for the last 3 and a bit years.
And we really appreciate you joining us so early in your new episcopal role, Guli. June.
Prinanda, I'm the Bishop of Llandaff, June Osborne, and I live in Llandaff, which is now a suburb of Cardiff.
Fantastic, thank you, June. And Pat.
Hi everyone, I'm Pat Story. I'm Bishop of Meath and Kildare, which you might gather from my accent is in the Church of Ireland. I'm centred really around the Midlands. It covers about 7 counties.
Fantastic, thanks Pat. And then we also have Sam Wells with us. Sam, do introduce yourself. You're on mute at the moment.
So sorry. Sam Wells, Vicar of St Martin the Fields in central London.
Great, fantastic. So in this webinar, we're going to focus on 3 aspects of the church making a contribution to God's reconciling work in the world. The first aspect will be facing and accepting loss. Second, embracing new opportunities for justice and equality. And third, bridge building across national boundaries. So sort of 3 parts to the conversation. Let's turn to the first of those. The arrival of the viral pandemic has created a range of losses for everyone beyond the obvious loss of lives. So I'm wondering what you and your churches have to offer people in facing and accepting our recent losses. Pat, let's hear from you first.
Thanks, Alice. I think that's a really interesting question, partly because I think this is something actually that the church excels at, is dealing with people with loss, because that's what we've always done. And so we're quite good actually at acknowledging loss of all kinds, ranging from loss of life to the loss of our normal lives in the last 13 months. And also recognizing that, you know, for many people, there's been gain. I'm not a morning person, so I have so enjoyed slow mornings. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to readjust back. I haven't missed all the time in the car and my bad back pain that I get through that. But the huge losses have been things like lack of ritual, which the church is really good at. So the lack of, in Ireland, it's the wake, the people queuing up, the masses of people who come to condole with the bereaved, the public services of Thanksgiving, just huge losses around that. I lost my dad a week before the first lockdown, and I found it such a lonesome experience grieving alone with no access to my sibling or my extended family. So lots and lots of loss around. And I think with clergy too, I feel that clergy have had a real loss of their sense of purpose and their sense of usefulness, because who are we if we're not out pastoring? I mean, that's the very essence of what most of us feel we were called to do. And so I think there's been a real struggle of identity. You know, I had to think, you know, who am I if I'm not the bishop, or if I'm not able to be in the role of bishop? So I think even personal loss around role. But I think what we can offer is vision and hope. You know, the reinstating, if you like, of ritual is going to be so important. We mightn't be able to hold a Thanksgiving service for every life lost, but I'm planning a diocesan service of remembrance, and probably a commitment. You know, our priorities might look different, a commitment to pastoral ministry immediately to try and pick up all those pieces. I think we're all nervous about what it's going to hold. And I think not to be afraid to talk about anxiety and depression, because that goes along with loss. But I think if anybody has something to offer into that space, the church really, really does. And also just, I suppose one of my challenges is that I sustain the devotional life that I've picked up. I love Dallas Willard's ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And I've certainly done that. And I really want to retain some of that. So I would say the church speaks hugely into all kinds of loss, but we mustn't forget there's actually been massive gain.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Pat. Guli, I'd love to hear a bit your reflections on this.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And I think, you know, what I'm going to share is probably going to build very much on what Pat's already said. As I've already indicated, I'm very much a person and a bishop in transition at the minute. And I confess that, you know, my thinking and my head is kind of all over the place in a sense. So I'm just going to really offer some very general observations about the role of the church, particularly within the context of England. My sense is that despite our increasingly perceived irrelevance as a church, many in England still turn to us, particularly at times of national grief or mourning, or indeed at times of rejoicing. And we've seen an example of that around the grief and the mourning for Prince Philip, where of course the church kind of comes into its own. So I have this sense that our greatest gift, perhaps in the current climate, is to help provide the opportunity to enable and perhaps even encourage people to lament, and to lament well. It's important, I think, that people are released from the pressure of that English sense of maintaining a stiff upper lip, but instead to find ways of giving voice to the pain and the loss that has been experienced in so many different ways. And I think there are a number of ways in which we can do this as a church. Firstly, we can use our buildings. The Church of England, you know, is blessed with many buildings, which in some ways are a noose around our necks increasingly. But we have this historic asset which still speaks powerfully to God's presence in our communities and to space for the community, where people can come and experience places of prayer and silence, where people can find solace and comfort and peace. We also have, and Pat mentioned this, you know, we have liturgies and rituals to offer, a very simple aid to the process of grieving, which can have profound impact. Lament for me is a place of meeting for people of all different different backgrounds and different experiences, where people can connect both with their own suffering and meet others who are suffering too. It brings us together as human beings, whether we're religious or not, and whatever our differences are. Mark Oakley says that lament does three things. First of all, by facing up to and expressing our feelings, we can begin to restore a sense of order amidst the chaos, just the beginnings of order. Secondly, by bringing our suffering to one another and before God, we bring it into a kind of relationship rather than allowing it to remain within ourselves and kind of stagnate and turn inwards. And finally, lament can act as a bridge between our old world and the new. Whether we know it or not, it can represent a move from disorientation towards reorientation. So as churches and cathedrals open up, I hope that we'll prioritise making our buildings available, both formally and informally, for people to find the beginnings of something new, to travel well alongside others, and to acknowledge, I think we really have to do this as Christians, to acknowledge that we don't have the answers, but that we're willing to walk alongside people patiently, to dwell with them, even when it's uncomfortable and difficult. And then very briefly to finish, having talked about lament, I just want to mention two other things. First is that I hope that we'll increasingly find our voice as people of faith to speak unequivocally and with confidence, albeit humility, about the hope that we have through faith. Again, Pat touched on this, and the possibility of new life coming from the most appalling loss. That is, after all, the Easter story, and it is our greatest story to share, that the cross, the symbol of greatest suffering, is the gateway to new life, and that somehow good things can arise from the ashes of the worst losses. And then lastly, if we want churches to be places that support and offer hope, I think that we have to learn to live as communities that demonstrate that hope in our own lives and in our actions. So we have to be willing to name our own personal losses, again, as Pat has done, and the losses of the church, including the loss of status and the marginal position of the church in society. I think we have to learn to be more real and stop pretending, so that God can use us well to help others face their loss and accept their losses, so that all of us together can find healing and turn our faces towards the new opportunities that lie ahead.
Thank you, Guli. That's really helpful. Sam, I'm wondering what you might want to add to what you've heard from Pat and Guli.
Not much to add, only to reinforce, I think, things that Bishop Pat and Bishop Guli have been saying. I think I want to highlight particularly the point that Bishop Pat started with and Bishop Guli introduced, very firmly towards the end, which is the role of the church is to be with people as they face the most uncertain and uncomfortable parts of their lives, and not to run away from that place. And it takes a great deal of character to stay when you can't make things better and you're being with people for whom life isn't getting any better anytime soon, because of bereavement, because of facing their own mortality, because of facing profound disruption that the pandemic has caused, these kinds of things. And this is the defining place of the church. You'll know, Alistair, because we used to work together, that whenever one of my colleagues gets a call to be at the bedside of somebody who's dying, or to be with someone who's just lost their job or some grievous event in their lives, I always say it's the most important thing you do. Don't feel you've got to get back in time for the PCC, or don't rush back for whatever it might be. This is the heart of your calling. So I do feel we've made a bit of a wrong step by becoming known around the country and around the UK, around Britain and Ireland, for being obsessed with our buildings and fixating on how quickly we could get back in our buildings to be together. Jesus seemed to manage a perfectly respectable incarnation without significant encounter with buildings. He got thrown out of the synagogue in Nazareth. He got a bit of a hard time in the temple at Jerusalem, although you might say he did cause a bit of the trouble there. You know, we haven't really modelled ourselves, I would say, sufficiently on Jesus in the last year, to the extent that we've become known as people who only wanted the government for one thing, which was permission to get back in our buildings. I think both Bishop Pat and Bishop Gully have highlighted ways in which we can be with people facing these traumatic things. And I think it's also important to say that while the pandemic has brought a lot of grief and trauma, I still, as a pastor, think the majority of things that most people in this country are going through are things that actually transcend the pandemic. They are the marriage breakup. They are the loss of a child in early pregnancy. That, you know, they are the grandparents' dementia. That these are the things that dominate our lives, and the pandemic has accentuated and accelerated a number of things. But I think that the fundamental things of life haven't actually changed as much as we talk about them a lot. They're on the news. We get statistics of deaths and so on. That's the things we have in common, but it's the things that we keep inside that I think grieve us the most. So I think the character of the clergy and all who serve in public ways in the church, I think, is most fully and faithfully made known, as both bishops have referred to, in our ability not to rush to outcomes. And I think the next stage in this we're going to face is I call it September. That's my word for it at the moment, which is whenever we're more out of this than in. And I think that's about September, but we'll see. The India example is obviously terrifying. And that is, I think, the next threshold we're going to face is we're going to have to pastor our people through a period where we're gently going to have to say, I'm afraid we're not going back to February 2020. That's not coming back again. That, you know, there isn't going to be a time before the pandemic that we can simply revert to. The new isn't going to be everything you like, but is going to include some wonderful things that we've discovered together. And so that place of the church that we can, I think, collude with, that it becomes a kind of transitional object, the one thing that doesn't change while everything else in our people's lives do change. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to provide that, even if we thought it was a good thing.
And my hunch is in that there is also going to be some grieving. There are going to be people who are longing to go back to the way it was, and we just are never going back there.
We're going to get some of the anger that's been directed towards the government, towards various other places, but it's mostly the anger of powerlessness, of just, why can't it be? You know, why can't I have back the world I thought I knew? There are a good number of people who actually didn't particularly like that world and are quite enjoying the prospect of a change. We don't tend to talk so much about them.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Sam. Let me check whether either Bishop June or Bishop Andrew wants to chip in at this point, or Bishop Pat or Bishop Gooley, if either of you wants to respond either to something you've heard from Sam or something additional that's come to mind. Go on, Andrew.
No, thank you. No, I couldn't agree more with what Bishop Pat and Bishop Gooley were saying. And the critique of buildings, being hung up on our buildings, and all of our buildings in Scotland are soggy Victorian buildings with nothing but. So the whole millstone round the neck thing is there. But we've had a real renaissance in our digital life. We were probably well behind in terms of our digital life in the church up here. And I know a lot of people weren't there, but picking up that theme, there are some people who didn't really like the world that we had before. We had a lot of people who were excluded from conventional church going. And the last 12, 13 months has really challenged that. What's it to be connected, and what's it to be part of a worshiping community? We're still trying to work out what we do when we do online communion. We don't go there. But there's just a whole load of positive issues where people have been able to engage in ways they couldn't before. So again, the loss and the gain has been part of that. And we're still making sense of that. We're all heads down, trying to deal with government regulations, trying to work out the pace that we can go at, look after our governance, and also look at these opportunities that might be there. So it's exciting as well as frustrating, and gain as well as loss. I definitely agree there's a balance in that.
And my hunch is that what you were saying, Bishop Gooley, about the significance of lament as part of the journey of trying to come to terms with and make sense of what's happened, that's an important piece of this, because we haven't yet made sense of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's impossible to come out of the other end, whatever that's going to look like, well, unless we do give time to face up to the pain and the loss. And I agree with everything that's been said about the need to face up to what's going to change and the realities that the future is going to be different. I wonder whether alongside that we also do have a role in not falsely, but providing comfort through speaking about those things that will never change. Speaking of God's kind of everlasting love, and saying something along the lines that although we don't know what the church will look like in a year, 10 years, whatever, that we are confident that there will still be a church which is reflecting God's love. So I think just amidst all the talk of change, just remembering that that our faith is built on something that is in essence unchangeable.
Well, that's maybe a good cue to sort of shift to our second aspect, because the viral pandemic has been massively disruptive, but such disruption can present opportunities for contributing something new to greater justice and equality in our world. And my sense is partly this is because inequalities in our nation have got highlighted, or in our nations, I should say, have got highlighted through the pandemic. They were always there, but things have in some ways come into sharper focus. So I'm wondering what the opportunities for contributing to greater justice might be, which you and your churches need to embrace over the coming year. June, it'd be great to hear from you at this point.
Thank you, Alistair. I've got three opportunities, and the first one, and the place I want to start really, is about the opportunity to speak the truth. There was a slogan early on in the pandemic about "we're all in this together," which I'm afraid had a very hollow ring for some of the communities that I serve. I was talking to one of the clergy in Cardiff, in the poorest area of Cardiff, last week, about what his experience of the last year had been. And he was telling me that for his community, before the pandemic started, people were just holding on, they were just managing to cope. And what the pandemic did was that it drowned them. And, he's been running around for a year now, trying to meet needs in his community. His neighbouring colleague, this time last year, I remember talking to her in a week when she'd done 10 funerals, of which 4 of them were the suicides of young men who'd been made redundant at the beginning of the pandemic. So, the first challenge for the church is to help society highlight the inequalities, because actually we haven't all had the same experience of COVID by any manner of means. And there's a tension in it, really, for us, because how do you, on one hand, speak truth about those inequalities, make sure that our society is living within those inequalities and facing up to them, whilst also recognising the dignity and generosity and beloved nature of the poorest. So that's the first opportunity, the opportunity to live truthfully as a society, because, truth has becoming a commodity in our world. And actually, as a church, we've got to stop that. The second one is about how to work and embrace change, which of course we're always in the business of. The kingdom of God has us telling a joyful story. But as Sam was highlighting, we've been having to tell that story outside the compound of church buildings. And as well as stepping outside our buildings, which in many ways has been very good for us, I think we also have to step outside our language. You know, I increasingly find it difficult. I use language on a daily basis, such as outreach and mission and evangelism and discipleship. But none of that language absolutely gets what the kingdom of God is about, which is that we don't take God to the people. We go working for greater justice, because that is where God is to be found, and where the children are hungry, where women are unsafe, where inequality is a way of life. And my third opportunity is really picks up what we've already begun to discuss, which is where the public discourse and the public mindset is at the moment. Because there are many people, as we have said, who are angry and broken and are having to rethink the pattern of their lives. How do we help people to find endurance and hope when that's what they are feeling and expressing? And the public discourse looks so much more unforgiving and unkind, unable to cope with conflict. And that's because, as we all know, change in the end requires huge conflict resolution of us. So the church absolutely has to take on the opportunity of, it has to be better at conflict resolution. Otherwise, we're just going to be buffeted around, tossed to and fro by the public discourse. That's enough, Alistair.
Thank you very much, June. And I particularly appreciate your point about the shift that's needed in terms of being attentive to what God is doing, where God is working, and where we need to respond to that, rather than thinking it's all got to come from the church. It's us being listening to and attentive to what we might sense God is doing in the world. Bishop Andrew, it'd be great to hear from you as well.
So I think picking up exactly that theme, so responding to what is going on in the world. I always feel we have a real danger in church in becoming quite inward looking and introverted. And this question of justice and remaining focused on God's justice, it's a challenge to being an association of people who like worshipping a certain way or like each other. And in Scotland, the Scottish Episcopal Church, we're the Anglican Church and a minor non-conformist denomination. It's very easy to become a little bit inward looking and focused when you're minor non-conformist denominations. I guess we are. But there is so much in the world. I was really struck at the beginning of the pandemic, the first few months, the glimpse of the possibility we saw about environmental justice and at enormous financial cost. The world shut down its industry and the sea ran clean and the air went clear, and just so many potentially positive impacts on environmental justice did appear, but not an answer. You can't just shut down human the human enterprise in the world, but it's a glimpse of what is possible. And again, from a pandemic point of view, up here in this diocese, we have a very, very long-standing link with the Diocese of Swaziland in Southern Africa. And Bishop Elina Wamukoya, personal friend and a real leading light in the Green Anglican movement, who died of COVID a few weeks ago. So in such a vulnerable part of the world, Bishop Elina fell ill and died. But her legacy, and it's encouraging us to have a season of creation within our liturgical year, and to decarbonize the life of our church and just work out what that means, and get all of we don't have any money in oil. I think we put it all in Netflix and Zoom, interestingly, about a year ago. So all these sorts of things happened. But there's definitely a justice issue with a glimpse of what is possible. And the pandemic has made this matter of public discourse so sharp, so much tension, and the issues that have bubbled up, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the issues of gender and women not being safe, and so statues being toppled or protests taking place even with COVID, or taking the knee. There's so many places where in the world justice issues are bubbling up. And as church, I think there is an opportunity to name that. We also have to name the fact that our own history is not good. Our own history in terms of slavery and race, our own history in terms of gender equality and women in leadership. And there's so many things that we have to name as churches, where we have a history we have to accept and be real about, and name where we are now. And I believe we can be signs. If we approach all these matters with some theological insight, we can be a sign of God's kingdom, even when things are so hard to resolve and change. We can be part of the public discourse. But we have to avoid that introversion. It's not about survival and ourselves and keeping ourselves going. It is about turning outside and facing up to these issues. So I think lots of opportunities.
Thank you, Bishop Andrew. And I think there's a thread there with the first part of the conversation about the need for some real honesty within the church about our complicity in some of the failures and injustices within our world, that's also part of this. But let's turn to Sam. I'd welcome your reflections at this point, Sam.
Yeah, I think that there's been, I think, 4 big things in the last year that have really had a strong bearing on this. One is obviously the pandemic, the way that it's highlighted about our society, and who gets the credit, who doesn't. The second is Black Lives Matter, and others have touched on the race issues, and obviously they've been very much in the news for the Anglican Church in the last couple of weeks. The third is climate change, and Andrew's already spoken about that. And the fourth, I think, is what the American election showed us about how fragile our democratic structures actually are. And there was just a moment in there where I think all of us, our heart missed a beat, thinking, hang on, this could all cave in a way that you wouldn't have dreamt imaginable a little while ago about America, a place where democracy is firmly entrenched as it is in America. So I've just jotted down three things as colleagues were talking that I think, and the reason I want to sort of create these 3 areas is because I think the whole area of justice is overwhelming for our people and for us. And so I think there's a ministry of breaking it down into manageable bite-sized chunks. So the 3 bite-sized chunks I'd recommend from the remarks of the 2 bishops so far, first of all, would be what justice looks like. You'd like to believe that, Augustine said that, without true worship, there can be no justice, that there's a part of the church that is committed to portraying justice. And obviously that's why the discussions of the last couple of weeks have been so humiliating and so humbling for, the Church of England in particular after the Panorama programme and so on, because we're not modelling what justice looks like, but that should be our aspiration. And then the second level is the struggle for justice. And we talked about taking the knee and marches and so on, and really being alongside those for whom regular justice is not a friend. And then the third level would be our attention to what justice doesn't cover. Mona Siddiqui did a really nice thought for the day a couple of days ago after the post office story about how untrue it was to say that the post office people had finally got justice, because for the ones who committed suicide, for the marriages that are broken up, for the damage, I mean, that some of the hurt was addressed by being vindicated. The damage, there's nothing that the justice system could do about that, and yet that should be precisely where the church is. So I think on the first 2 areas, we've got an awful lot of humble pie. There's an awful lot of humility needed from the church, first of all, because our own house doesn't look like what justice looks like. And then secondly, in relation to the struggle for justice, is we're very often, as I think you've hinted in your comments, Alistair, we're joining struggles that others have initiated and we should have initiated, but we're late to the party, and we must have the humility not to say it's all got to be done on our own terms with our own language. You guys are doing this better than we are, and we're just simply going to join in and have the humility to be sort of somewhere back on the march rather than always holding the banner at the front. But on the third area, what justice doesn't cover, that is the one word answer for that is the gospel. I mean, it really is about the forgiveness of sins and life everlasting. Those are the two things the justice system can't give you, and they are the two biggest things the church stands for. So, in that sense, any involvement in justice should be a renewal of our core principles as a church.
Yeah, and on that last point, Sam, my sense is that you're partly talking about the difference between sort of the way justice is often used in sort of familiar terms in terms of a legal system, and what the biblical witness is of a vision of shalom and of wholeness, and of things being fully set to right. But have I got that?
Yes, I mean, in very simple terms, you've got the justice system, you've got a whole culture of civil society, the rule of law, what we regard as normal, as a second level, and then on a third level, you've got the sort of the element of struggle, that sense of restoring that, and so, you do tend to reveal your own class and social location by which of those you think is the normal one. It gives away a lot about where each of us, where our friends are. Our university friends, if we went to university, are now, involved as senior barristers or senior judges or something like that, and then you give away the fact that that you're linked very much to the first kind of justice. If your friend was just assaulted by a police officer while simply driving a car, then you're revealing that your natural place of justice is the third one, and we do reveal a lot about ourselves by which one we think is the normal one.
Yeah, and so again, that's bringing back to some real humility and honesty needed in how we engage with issues around justice.
But I hope also distinguishing where where the gospel is actually doing its most significant work, which is, I think, justice is very, very important. Of course it is, but even when you've achieved justice, there is, for Christians, still the majority of the work still to do.
Fantastic, thanks, Sam. Pat or Guli, either of you like to come in, or June, Andrew, if you want to respond to maybe what you've heard either from the other or from Sam.
I suppose I was struck by, we've been talking a lot about the macro level, if you like, and at the micro level, I think I've been really struck by how the pandemic has highlighted inequality in domestic life. In that, certainly in Ireland, and I'm sure in the rest of the world, we've had a huge rise in domestic violence, and I think bad marriages have got worse, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean badly functioning marriages have got worse, and good marriages have probably got better. And I think the church needs to speak about both those things. Condemning and supporting people in domestic violence situations, but also not being afraid to celebrate the fact that family life has got better through the lack of busyness and the more time together. I get such joy from walking along the canal nearby and seeing families out with their bikes, and it really didn't happen a lot through busyness before. So I think there's a lot of challenge, but I also think we need not forget that there's actually a lot to celebrate and to maybe hold on to after this, that we're kind of almost afraid to, because we have to focus on the inequalities, of course we do, but I think domestically it's actually been very revealing as well.
Yeah, no, for me it's been one of the very striking things walking locally, is seeing a parent with a child at all sorts of different points in the day, and that sense of parents, fathers and children, mothers and their children having time with one another that they might not have had otherwise. Thanks, Pat. Yes, who else would like to chip in before we give participants a chance just to have a conversation in some breakout groups? Yeah, Julie.
Well, I'm just wondering whether I can take the opportunity to mention housing and the Archbishop's recent Commission on Housing and the report that was produced just a couple of months ago called Coming Home, the Archbishop's Commission on Housing, Church and Community. I think I was introduced in the blurb for this webinar as also being the new lead bishop for housing. And again, I am really very new to it and learning all kinds of incredible things about housing that I had absolutely no idea about. But I suppose I'm struck in all this talk of justice and injustice and what the pandemic has laid bare for us in terms of the realities of the suffering of those who are most marginalized in our society, that I think the common feature between a lot of them is poor housing. So whether it's domestic abuse, as Pat has referred to, whether it's mental health problems, whether it's homelessness, you know, so many of the problems, if you take them right back to the root, lack of suitable housing can be at the heart of what then presents all kinds of other problems. And I suppose I just want to name the enormous challenge and the opportunity for churches and the church as a whole to be part of rebuilding society, and being part of the solution to what is widely recognized as the housing crisis. So the report, it challenges government absolutely to work on a longer term strategy across different parties, but also presents us as the church with a challenge to use our land, of which certainly in the Church of England we have a vast amount, much of which is available for development, whether it's held by the church commissioners, whether it's held by individual dioceses, or indeed by local parishes, to find ways of working with other partners in order to use some of our land at least to develop affordable housing, and in doing so partnering with others to demonstrate that we're more concerned about looking outwards to the needs of the world and seeing where God is already work. Again, we've had that theme crop up, and less obsessed by our internal struggles and also by our fear of lack of survival. So the more we turn outwards, I think the healthier our internal life will be.
Thank you, Bishop Goody. Yes, and I mean, it was one of the things I was struck by even in the first lockdown, the difference for families who had their own separate bedroom for each child, and what that child then was, how they were able to engage with what a school was offering, and those families that didn't, was just, you know, a small example of what you're saying about the inequalities that often there are in housing, and how big a difference that has made over this last year. Maybe one more reflection before we give participants a chance to share in breakout groups. No one's rushing to it. So actually, maybe this is a natural point then to give people a chance to have a conversation with one another in their breakout groups. And so there's two things I would invite you. So you're going to go into a group with most of you should be in a group of 3. You're going to have 9 minutes for a conversation, so roughly 3 minutes, 3 minutes each. But what's resonated for you from what you've heard from the 4 bishops and from Sam this afternoon? What's resonated? What's kind of connected for you? And what would you want to add? Those are the 2 things I'm inviting you to share with one another. What's resonated and what would you want to add? So Ben, I'm hoping that you're ready to send folks off into breakout groups, and if you could give folks 9 minutes for their conversation, that would be great. Welcome back. I hope that's been a useful way for you to process something of what you've heard so far this afternoon, and to keep you engaged for this final part. We're now going to turn to the third aspect of our conversation, that of building bridges across national boundaries. One of the things I've noticed is that the pandemic has provoked an increase in tensions between nations and a stronger focus on defending national interests. Within our British and Irish context, this has certainly been exacerbated by the UK's exit from the European Union. And I think we've also seen greater strains in the ties which bind together the countries which form the United Kingdom. So what I'm wondering for each of our bishops is, how does this look from where you are located? And let's start with you, Pat.
Yeah, it's covering that in 3 minutes, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the most obvious exhibition of the tension recently has been the violence on the peace line, mainly by the PUL community, the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. And I think that demonstrates the anger and the sense, I suppose, of being disenfranchised over the Irish sea border. And also that lurking feeling in that Unionist community that they're going to be abandoned. And that's exacerbated by perhaps Boris Johnson saying, you'll never have an Irish sea border, to suddenly having an Irish sea border. And I think it's so much easier to demonize than it is to understand. And I'm not for a moment excusing burning buses and firing things at police officers. But underneath the surface with particularly working class Protestants, working class loyalists, is that sense that nobody wants us. The mainland UK don't want us. The Republic of Ireland don't want us. And to some extent, that's true. But the sense, I think, of abandonment and disenfranchisement that causes means that that's bubbling under the surface all the time. And actually, it only takes a sense of betrayal for that to erupt. So that I suppose the national tension has been most obvious in Northern Ireland and in that Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. But along the borders as well, there's increasing anger over the red tape that Brexit has involved, where there really have been empty supermarket shelves because products haven't been able to, I can't order on Amazon anymore, a total national disaster. But that's just a symbol, if you like, of, again, that sense of being cut off, of not being equal. We've been terrible as nations, I think, about a unified approach to the pandemic. You know, the DUP will say one thing and the Sinn Féin will say another. And the vaccination, we can't even agree on a vaccination programme because the Republic of Ireland is in the EU and Northern Ireland isn't. So even a long-standing tension between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has been completely exacerbated by Brexit and then by the Irish sea border. And I can foresee with, bids for independence coming up in the other nations that this is going to be a huge challenge the next 5 to 10 years on what is the United Kingdom, what is that going to look like, what nations will it involve, and also in terms of justice, how do we listen to learn rather than simply listen to demonize? And so I think that there needs to be resources put into that community which are so angry and feeling so betrayed.
Thank you very much, Pat. Well, speaking of countries with a bid for independence, there's a very natural segue into hearing from Bishop Andrew in Scotland.
Yes, it's sometimes described as one of those third rail issues. Just don't talk about independence, whatever you do, because it's and in fact, we've got the other side, or most of the other side of the same Irish sea border. So in Scotland, when you go down to Stranraer, down at Cairnryan, that's the other side of something increasingly uncomfortable. But no, we've got our elections next week. It's the Holyrood Parliament. Scottish elections are next week, and so potential tensions bubbling up over independence again. Our last referendum was 2014, and that was a difficult time. Whatever flavor, whatever opinion, wherever you wanted to go, 2014 was a hard year. Pretty much everybody managed to disagree with everybody wherever they were on the issue. Looking around the whole of the UK and Ireland, things do seem strained. I think your question is absolutely right, Alistair. There's a strain in the binds that seem to connect us, and the values that the other countries maybe seem to have. Even saying the phrase "the other countries," there's a sense of other in it, and things do feel strained at the moment. Brexit was not the popular vote here in Scotland, although a significant minority did vote to leave. A lot of fishermen who are now not happy, and farmers who are now not happy, and there's a lot of ragged ends of the Brexit debate, and a lot of ragged ends of the independence debate are still there, and I feel it bubbles up in a dissatisfaction with the institutions, whether it's Westminster as a UK institution, or Holyrood as our own parliament, or even the churches get a bit of it. We get, why aren't you more supportive of? Why aren't you stronger against? Why aren't you taking a stronger line? All these issues come up, and there's a general dissatisfaction with institutional life and anyone who's perceived as being self-interested. All of this for us in Scotland is seen through the lens of independence or not. There is a polarisation within Scottish politics, and the SNP, the Scottish National Party, may or may not get a 50% majority. Holyrood was designed to prevent that happening. We have a proportional representation system, so no party should get a majority, and independence has skewed that. I think there is also a real lack of trust, and there's a lack of trust within the institutions in Scotland, and maybe a lack of trust looking at some of the other nations, some of the rhetorics and politics in Hollywood and in Holyrood versus Westminster show quite a bit of a lack of trust. I know one of our microbreweries up here made a beer called Barnard Castle Eye Test, which is a very, very popular one. There's a whole load of signs of a certain lack of trust that can appear. And as I was saying a wee bit earlier, there's a danger we can get introverted in our countries as well. I know, because each country's approached the whole pandemic differently. We have different rules. We're allowed, I have to have them written on the wall behind my computer screens, how many people can go into what building and what numbers from what household on what date. And I can't listen to the London radio in the morning now because it's wrong. It's not what we have to do. So I think trying to remain as churches, knowing that we are all Christians together. We are Anglicans in this meeting here, but we are Christians together, despite all those differences in our countries. It is a hard message to keep when things are quite so polarized. Yeah.
It's so very fragile, it feels like at this point. June, let's turn to you in Wales.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, there's great national pride in Wales, of course, and what is interesting to me is that I think, I've not tested this theory out, but I think that the support for independence in Wales has definitely shifted from being a rather niche interest of a minority to being a mainstream discussion. I went to a discussion at the School of Journalism in Cardiff, run by Tortoise, the online news platform, a think-in that they were running. And the question was put to the audience, and the audience was largely younger end adults. Which of you have changed your mind about Welsh independence in the last 5 years? And absolutely everybody put up their hand. Now, if you ask me to analyse that, I think some of it is the Welsh Language Act, that being a bilingual nation is now given and normative. And of course, language is very powerful. I think it's the existence of the Senedd. Nobody in Wales would pretend that devolution works perfectly, but the Senedd, it took us a long time to reach devolution in Wales, as you probably know, and it's a symbolic expression now of Welsh agency. And the third thing, I think, is just the viability of small nations, particularly, knowing how small nations across Europe have thrived. If you take the example of Estonia, which is even smaller than Wales, and how it's reinvented itself, come out from under long years of oppression and domination into being really quite a digital powerhouse. These are some examples that a nation like Wales can hold on to. So whereas at one stage it would have seemed rather kind of nonsensical to talk about Welsh independence, it's a serious subject. I emigrated from England to Wales 4 years ago, and I suppose I have to make a confession that I was absolutely astounded by how different it looks when you live this side of the border. I now find myself able to talk about the, effortless, patrician, superior attitudes of the English, because I inhabit it. I suppose one of the questions, can you persuade England, the English, to understand itself as being only one of 4 nations which make the whole? Because until we reach that point where England imagines itself differently, I think we are going to have difficulty framing the conversation about what the UK is about. And within that, I watch out now for the partiality of Westminster, that there are many examples during this pandemic, I think, where the Welsh government know that the financial requests of Wales for response were treated less favourably than the English ones were. And that just breeds a level of resentment and insult. So I suppose what I'm saying is this is a conversation, this is a subject about the national imagination. And actually the Christian task is about redeeming the imagination and reframing it. So we have to ask ourselves, in the imagination of the UK at the moment, what is fixed and secure? What is on the move? And what ought the Christian church to be challenging in that imagination? How broad ought our imagination to be? Do we see ourselves as global citizens, as national citizens, or are all those categories no longer useful?
Thank you very, very much, June. And so someone who's located in England and very aware of the kind of English-centric nature of the worldview in BBC and media and a lot of things in this country, let's turn to Bishop Cooley. What's your take on this? How does this look for you being located in England?
Thank you. I mean, as Pat said, this is a massive question, isn't it? And Pat, you said you were given 3 minutes. I was only given 2 minutes, so even less time to try and say something sensible. And of course, I'm conscious that I don't speak as an English person. I arrived in this country as a refugee when I was 14, so I have lived here most of my life, but I don't speak as an English person. One of the things that strikes me is that, it's the question of power. We haven't mentioned power yet. I think certainly historically of the 4 nations, England would have been, and potentially, arguably still is, the most powerful, or at least is perceived to have the most power, and how it uses that, or how it's perceived to use that, is very significant. But at the same time, my sense is that English people have much less of a sense of what their identity is. I will often hear people speaking with great pride about being Irish or Scottish or Welsh. I very, very seldom hear that with English people. If I hear it within the context of England, it'll be, you know, I'm a Yorkshire person, or I'm a Cornish person, or whatever it is. So the need to fracture even more. So it says something to me about England perhaps not being quite at ease or at peace with its past, which has brought it to where it is now. And drawing back on some of the earlier themes we were talking about, I'm not sure England has ever fully lamented or even repented of its colonial past well enough. So there's a certain amount of guilt that still hangs around, but there isn't really a kind of peaceful resolution. And I think that guilt and all the other complexity around it then plays into the ongoing relationships between England and the other three nations. And so in Christian terms, what I'd be wanting to say to the English nation is, how do we look to the whole of the United Kingdom in a way that demonstrates that we are seeking the well-being of the other and not just our own? And I think some of the policies, particularly around Brexit and particularly in relation to Northern Ireland, you know, that's not what has been demonstrated. What's been demonstrated is a real concern for English priority and not for the other partners within the United Kingdom. And this in turn, I think, mirrors the fact that society itself is full of fractures at the minute. So many people are struggling to know who they are, to define their identity. And often identities are being defined in ever smaller groupings, over and against others, where there's lack of trust and lack of understanding between people. And this is where the church comes in. If we can open our hearts and minds enough to be less obsessed with our own internal problems, we could be places where we develop and grow communities where people are truly feel that they can both be known and know, if I can put it like that, to build relationships, to have a kind of deep sense of confidence in who we each are, and then in that confidence to reach out across the diversity and to recognize, in Christian terms, our identity in Christ, and more broadly our identity as human beings with others. The problem is that as Christians we find it so much easier to talk about this than to live it, and we find it so difficult to trust one another, and if we can't do that within our own life in the church, then how can we possibly live it and reflect it more widely? So I think it's a huge challenge for the nation of England within the context of the United Kingdom, but also actually for the church. And it's one that we have to continue grappling with, especially in this kind of liminal season, as we begin to understand what shape the future might begin to look like. So yeah, huge challenge, and I just hope that some of that speaks into where other people are at.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Goody. Sam, St Martin's has sometimes been called the parish church of England. How do you view this from where you're located?
I think we've lost a sense that the future is bigger than the past. You know, I think we in our struggle for identity, respectively, we're too much going back to. I have this notion of 1952. You know, after many years trying to speculate what is this moment in the past that we as church leaders are constantly told we need to get back to, when the church somehow got it right. I think I've located 1952 as round about the key year. And it's not a year I feel good about, really, because it's about the last year when the word empire really meant anything. And before being displaced largely by Commonwealth. It was racist, it was sexist, but somehow this is the, and in America it was McCarthyist, but you know, this is the time that somehow we're constantly told we need to get back to, when it all worked. Well, it only ever worked for some people, as far as I can tell. I don't have that nostalgia. That's one reason why I use the phrase "a future that's bigger than the past" as a kind of clarion call for a renewal of the church, because I don't think we're in the business of trying to get back to some purer, you know, I'm very suspicious of the word pure, you know, some purer time when we, you know, didn't lock our doors or whatever the great thing that we look back to. So you know, the thing that really bothered me about the Scottish referendum in 2014, and it happened again in 2016, was that those who were advocating for the Remain position and the you know, the stay as the Union position in Scotland, I'm afraid I can't remember the difference between yes and no. And I struggled even at the time. Was that the argument was fought entirely on economic terms, and I think that was a profound mistake on both occasions. You know, all these life assurance companies are going to relocate to London if Scotland leaves, this kind of thing, and people ended up putting two fingers up to that to a large degree, even more so in 2016, and said we're not just economic animals. We do have core identities that transcend our economic interest, and that's why you got such vast tracts of the country voting against their own economic interest in 2016, which, you know, was just bewildering to many of the people running the country. It seems to me the church is in the identity business. You know, baptism is the foundation of the church. Baptism is 100% about identity. And I think we do need to engage these questions of identity and tell a bigger story. That's a lot of what our role is about. But you can only do that by listening, as you know, as Pat has put very eloquently about the unionist communities in Belfast, particularly. You've got to listen to what threatens people's identity. You know, it has to come with a pastoral heart. But there's a bigger story to tell, and Christianity is calling people into a bigger story where we don't have to retreat into these smaller and smaller identities. I've never forgotten, in 1997, I heard a Slovakian, and if you, just to get the history straight, you know, they'd just broken away from the Czech Republic. I heard a Slovakian talking in Scotland. I was in Scotland at the time, and talking about the prospects for greater devolution for Scotland and so on at the time. We weren't using the word independence at the time. And he said, don't do it. You know, the people advocating for this in Slovakia sounded like they were take back control people, but they would take back control to our little clique, our little elite, who were going to run the country henceforward. And he said that's what Slovakia's turned into. It was grabbed by a bunch of people who had advocated independence from Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic for their own interests. I've never forgotten that. You know, what are the interests of the people demanding this secession? But I think England has been guilty of all the things that have been described. And I've done it myself, even when I lived in Scotland for a significant period. I know I do it too. You use words like England and Britain as if they were synonyms, and it's absolutely wrong to do that. And it's just so many kinds of wrong to do that. It shows arrogance, ignorance, and a bunch of other things. So what June's experiencing, I know what you're talking about, and I do it myself. I shouldn't do it. I'm sorry I do, and I regret it every time I do, and feel embarrassed with my friends from the other parts of the UK. But I do think to lose the UK would be terribly, terribly sad. We've made one massive mistake, in my view, in the last 5 years. Let's not make another one.
Which kind of leads into thinking about, you know, so what is the role for our churches in this? And so doing some work of listening, of exploring identity clearly sounds like part of that. What other thoughts do any of you have on the role for the church in trying to bridge some of these tensions across national boundaries, find helpful ways to hang in there together?
Can I start by pointing out what a joyful story the Anglican Church has got in this, and what a lot Anglicanism has to offer? Because actually the 4 provinces are so strongly distinctive and independent. You know, the narrative of the Church in Wales is nothing like the Church of England, and that is a really joyful factor, because we share lots of things in common, including our social theology in Anglicanism. And the other bit I would just wave the banner for is disestablishment. That's what Wales can offer. And I have for my whole life been an enthusiastic supporter of the established church. But I have to say that in this day and age, disestablishment really helps, because there is no sense of entitlement. Whatever the church, whatever place the church has in the national life of Wales, it has to earn it. It was, the church in Wales was coercively, it was coercion of and the most unholy alliance that brought about the disestablishment of the 6 dioceses of Wales. And yet, in a funny kind of way, it's actually been the best challenge that it could, and it has really raised to that challenge 100 years later. I think it is worth the Church of England taking seriously the benefits of disestablishment.
Well, there's a challenge for us in the Church of England. Thank you, June. Yes, any of
I wonder whether I can pick up, because I think what I was going to say briefly actually follows on quite nicely from June, or at least offers another part, or the flip side of the coin or something. So absolutely, to Anglicanism, I want to echo that, but to broaden it even further and talk about the importance of ecumenism across our different boundaries, because if we're going to really have an impact as Christians and as churches, then working ecumenically is the way to go. And it kind of brings into focus the whole question about identity and how we understand ourselves and how we understand ourselves in partnership with others. And I've become very profoundly aware of this through my work with the Conference of European Churches, KEC, of which I'm a vice president, which brings together, I think it's something like 114 member churches right across Europe, so including representatives from England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and all across Europe, members of the EU and more widely, kind of network of churches encouraging closer working together, and also a kind of combined voice into the European institutions and the questions around justice and immigration and the movement of people across Europe. So I think we have a much stronger voice together than we do separately, despite the frustrations of working ecumenically, which those of you who've done that will know about well. And then the other, finally, briefly, is the flip side of establishment and disestablishment. Really interesting, June, and I absolutely take your point. And I certainly don't want to argue here about the rights and wrongs of establishment or disestablishment. But I suppose I wanted to say, as someone who's about to go into the House of Lords against all my expectations, that as we have that role currently, regardless of the rights or wrongs of it, then let's use it well. And what I hope to be able to do is use that voice and whatever influence it gives me to allow for the church to speak into political situations, to try and be part of affecting change for what will hopefully be a better and more equal society.
Thank you, Goody. Yes, Andrew.
So again, coming from my minor non-conformist denomination background, where we were never disestablished because we were never established. Totally different history. We were just suppressed and persecuted, so that's kind of different. But no, I think what I'd offer in just the few moments we have is holding lightly onto the political context and the background, and not taking a unionist stance, not taking an independent stance, but I'm really reflecting hard on what you said earlier, Sam, about the gospel. Now, ultimately, we are there to proclaim the gospel. We are there. Yeah, justice will be part of this. Engaging with how those who are weak and vulnerable can be protected, whatever happens politically. But ultimately, we're called to proclaim the gospel. And as churches in different countries, and the Scottish English Union's this novel 321-year experiment, maybe try something different. Who knows what will happen? But we can still proclaim the gospel that we've had for so many centuries more than that. And how we do that, and how we do that together, and how we do it with the different churches represented here and all the ecumenical partners that we have, I suppose that's what we do as churches, holding lightly onto the onto the political situation as far as we can and proclaiming the gospel.
Well, that seems like maybe a good note to draw us towards a close, which is coming back to the heart of our faith, to Jesus, and to sharing some good news that comes out of God's work in the world through Jesus, and that is part of what we're called to be offering. Thank you all so much for participating, coming along for this webinar. A big thank you to our bishops, to Andrew, Uli, June and Pat, as well as to Samuel. So do offer a little reaction, either a real clap or using the reactions on Zoom, just to show your appreciation. Our next joint Reconciliation Initiatives Heart Edge webinar will be on the 20th of July. Very much picking up on what Guli was talking about just at the end there, building bridges across Europe. We will have a brother from the Taizé community, a German pastor from Berlin, the Dean of Coventry Cathedral, and Robert Innes, the bishop who heads up the Bishop in Europe, in conversation, thinking about how we can do more to build those bridges across Europe. So do hope you'll be able to join us then. But let's draw towards a close. Pat, would you close for us with a closing prayer, and then we can say goodbye to everyone.
I will indeed, thanks. And I've stolen this from the Church of England, so there's partnership. Let's pray. Creator God, may every breath we take be for your glory. May every footstep show you as our way. That trusting in your presence in this world, we may, beyond this life, still be with you, where you are alive and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Sorry. Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you all very much.